This is a read aloud of the 203 unit test point of view. Read the passage, a historic day for women. In 2 months, my brother Roger would turn 21 years old. Roger was looking forward to his birthday because my father had promised him more responsibility at the haberdashery. I was envious of this milestone, but not because of the added duties my brother would take on in terms of the family business. It was because he would be allowed to cast his very first vote in a federal election in November. This struck me as the ultimate injustice. Roger did not know the first thing about politics or the people involved at the federal level, or the state level for that matter. As far back as I can remember, I have been watching my mother and her friends propel the movement for equal voting rights in New York. They achieved a lofty goal 3 years ago when women were granted the right to vote in state elections in 1917. When I was disappointed upon realizing that the decision applied only to state and local elections, my mother encouraged me to trust that change was coming. Many states across the country are already allowing women to vote in all elections, she pointed out. It's only a matter of time until it happens here in New York. My mother told me to be patient, and I knew that she had certainly been patient. Her mother had also campaigned for voting equality, as the marches, protests, rallies, and fundraising had been going on for 50 years. I couldn't understand how the whole group was not completely exhausted by the effort. My mother and her friends would meet at one of their houses almost every night, after taking care of their families all day, to plan another rally or meeting. They did it all in the face of strong opposition from anti-suffragists who were threatened by the idea of a woman casting a vote. Somehow, the failures and rejections never seemed to wear them down, and in fact, failure seemed to encourage them. I watched the late night meetings that were held in our home, and I would see the women start to fade and become mentally drained as the evening wore on. Then one of them would bring up a much discussed topic, such as entrenched political interests or government regulation, and they all would quickly get a second wind, offering their opinions about how things should be. They didn't always agree on politics, but they agreed that their voices should be heard. The thought of being so close to the voting booth for federal elections carried them through their fatigue. These women had become a part of a tightly woven fabric of suffragette clubs that covered the state, and it was a true team effort. No one wanted to let anyone else down. One morning last week, all their efforts came to fruition. I was just finishing up my chores when my mother burst through the front door with news that the 19th Amendment had been ratified by Congress. Never, usually at a loss for words, my mother told me the news in stilted fragments and stood there speechless. I stared at her for a moment, incredulous. Betty's house. We'll celebrate. As we hastily ran down the steps of our building, I began to hear the wave of celebration already taking over the city. Anyone who had heard the news break over the radio moments before was outside spreading the word in the streets. As Betty's house, the suffragettes toasted their hard-fought victory. I watched in amazement as they quickly tempered their joy with the new, self-imposed responsibilities they would bear now that the women had the vote. That very afternoon, they set about organizing a club for women voters that would disseminate information about politics and the people campaigning in federal elections. Everything had changed that day. I knew that in just 3 years I would be allowed to enter a voting booth, and my opinion about who would lead the country would be counted. Question 1. What effect does the narrator's point of view have on the reader's experience of the events? A. The reader receives a broad historical overview of the women's suffrage movement from an objective source. B. The reader learns about the women's suffrage movement from the standpoint of someone who is close to it, but has not worked in it. C. The reader is allowed to share directly in the feelings of a leader of the women's suffrage movement. Question 2. Which information would the reader know if the mother were the narrator? A. Details of the planning discussions about a women's voters club. B. What the father thought about his wife's involvement in politics. C. Details of how 19th Amendment was ratified by Congress. Question 3. Which information would the reader know if Roger were the narrator? The perspective of someone who could vote. A. B. How federal law affects the family's business. C. More details about the votes cast in Congress. Question 4. How does the point of view shape what the reader learns from the narrative? The reader senses the impatience of a woman who gains from the women's movement but was not present in its early days. B. The reader comes to appreciate the varied feelings of a wide range of women and men who worked for women's right to vote. C. The reader is given a rare glimpse into the mind of one of the pioneers of the women's movement. 5. Which statement best describes the narrator's reliability? A. The narrator is unreliable because she has such strong feelings about equal voting rights. B. The narrator is unreliable because her knowledge of women's suffrage is limited to her own experience. C. The narrator is reliable because the way she describes events is logical given her limited point of view. Question 6. What would most likely be the effect if the narrator of this passage were unreliable? A. The passage would end with a twist because the reader would have been kept in the dark about key facts. B. The narrator would state where her mother was when the 19th Amendment was ratified. C. The reader would learn about the narrator's thoughts and emotions. Question 7. What is one way the author creates tension in the passage? The pace of the narration remains the same throughout the passage. B. The narrator's descriptions do not seem truthful. C. The passage begins in the present, then shifts to the past, and then concludes in the present. 8. What is one way the use of a limited narrator creates tension in the passage? A. The narrator's thoughts are not given in the passage. B. The narrator does not know that women will eventually get the right to vote. C. The narrator is able to flash back to different points in time. Question 9. Would you like 3 free points? Yes or no?